Hello everyone, welcome back to Story of the World Chapter Highlights. This is chapter 19 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now, all of our chapter today takes place in Asia. We're first going to talk about China, and then we'll move on to talk about Indochina, which is the area we know as Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. We're going to talk about how rebellions were working in those countries against foreign powers. Now, the first part of our chapter today talks about China. Now, at this time in China, it was the early 1900s, and for a very long time, the Empress Shi had been ruling over China. Okay, and she was known as the last empress after this because she was the last empress of China. Now, Shi knew she didn't want the power to go back to the previous emperor. So she made sure for when she died that there would be an heir, someone to take over, another boy from the Qing Dynasty. Now, she decided on this boy, Puyi. Now, Puyi was very young. He was only 3 years old at the time. And Dowager Dragon Empress Shi died, and he was put on the throne of China. Now, obviously, since he was a very young boy, he wasn't given the power to rule China. And instead, like we see many times, there was regents who helped him rule. They treat him like a god. Now he was, given lots of luxuries, given lots of gifts. He was followed around everywhere he went. And growing up, probably around his first 10 years of life, he never even met another child. He was really treated like a god, and he was kept within the Forbidden City, which is the palace within China. His regents did everything for him. They thought really they had the power, but at this time, Russia, Japan, the United States, Great Britain, they all had influence over China, and they were really the countries that were making the decisions in China and controlling the regents. Now, as time passed a few years later, in 1911, there was issues going on in Sichuan province in China. Now, the people in Sichuan wanted to build a railroad. Their dream was to have a railroad made by the Chinese and owned by the Chinese. This was really their dream. And officials said they wanted to do this. So they were like, let's build the railroad and it'll be owned by the Chinese people and the Chinese government and the officials, everyone in China. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough money. And the Chinese government stepped in and said, okay, we will help make it, but we're going to lend money from foreign powers. This was France, Germany, England, and they wanted to borrow money from their banks so they could build their railroad. The problem with this would mean then the railroad was owned by foreign powers, and the people in Sichuan were not happy about this. So they rebelled. They were really angry. They were like, we're sick of foreign powers in our country. We want a strong China. So what happened was in the end of 1911, going into 1912, they did this, okay? And a lot of this was led by this guy, okay? Sun Yishan. What he did, he became the head of a new party. This party in China was the Nationalist Party, okay? So they believed in China. China is number one, the Chinese people are number one, and we should be proud of that, okay? And yeah, what they did was, so Puyi had still been the emperor at this time. They said, okay, he can stay in the Forbidden City, in the Forbidden Palace, okay? But he won't have any power. And so they just put him in there and left him, basically. He had English tutors who came in and taught him things. But yeah, he basically just stayed there. And Sun Yishan became the new leader in China, okay? He was really proud of China and really wanted it to be a strong nation. Sun Yishan is very important because he came up with 3 principles for China. He wanted China to be, not ruled by lords anymore, not ruled by foreign powers. So he came up with these 3 principles. His first principle was democracy. So he wanted it so everyone in China would be able to vote for who was leading them. His second thing he did was livelihood. Now, livelihood just means he thought everyone in China should have access to food and be able to find a job, be able to find work. And the last thing was nationalism, which was the name of his party. And he said, China should be owned by the Chinese. And this was the start of China turning into a republic. Now, let's move on to the second part of our chapter today. The second part of our chapter takes place in Indochina. Now, at this time, there was lots of different foreign powers in Indochina. So all the areas were split amongst them. Now, at this time, Britain, owned part of Siam, which is now what we call Thailand, and also Burma at the top here. But the rest of Indochina was owned by France. So Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and the other part of Siam. This was one of the only areas where France had really held on to. In Canada and North America, they'd been pushed out. They'd been pushed out of South Africa and a lot of different places. But Indochina was really where they had colonized and, really settled down there. Okay, so yeah, it was all split up into these different regions, but mainly owned by France. Now, for around 100 years, this word might be a little difficult, but it's the Qing Dynasty, like to win something. So the Qing Dynasty had ruled over Vietnam specifically for around 100 years. So when the French came in, they didn't really know what to do with this emperor. So they said, okay, you can stay and be the emperor, but we are going to make all the decisions. So the emperor didn't really have any power. They were more just like a symbolic head of Vietnam. The Vietnamese at this time, under the French rule, were normally made to work on plantations or in mines, and they earned very little money. Any money that was earned from these places went to the French people who were in control of these areas. So the Vietnamese really weren't earning much from this. Now, this is when people started to get really angry. They didn't want foreign rule anymore, the same as what had happened in China. They wanted Vietnam to be Vietnamese. So Phan Boi Chau, this man here, he decided he was going to rise up against French control. And in 1908, he created the Restoration Society. This meant he wanted to restore power in Vietnam to the Vietnamese, as he thought it should be. One important thing he really did during this, he convinced a prince from the Qing Dynasty, so not the emperor, but one of the princes. He convinced one of the princes to join his society and help rebel against the French. Unfortunately, the French weren't happy, okay? They weren't going to take any rebellions. They'd already lost lots of land around the world, and they weren't going to go give up Indochina that easily, okay? So Phan Boi Chau got a little nervous, okay? And he got scared and he ended up running away from Vietnam and went to Japan. In Japan, he started to settle down and, started to make roots there. But Japan found out he was there and found out he was a rebel. And they went, we don't want any problems with Vietnam. We don't want any problems with France. So they kicked him out the country. So he thought, where can I go next? And he went to China. Now, in China, he started making more of these groups, like the Vietnamese Restoration Society. And he tried to rebel from China. He tried to start a rebellion in Vietnam from China. And the Chinese also weren't happy. They were like, we don't want any problems with the French. So they decided to arrest him in 1914. And then after some time, they released him. They thought, it's no good. And he still tried to do these rebellions from France. Now, sometime later, Phan Boi Chau was in Shanghai in China. And as he was walking around, unfortunately for him, there was 2 French soldiers. And the soldiers knew what he looked like. He had a very recognizable face. And, they were told to look out for him. And they saw him and they decided to arrest him on the spot and take him back to Vietnam. So Phan Boi Chau was taken back to Vietnam, where he was put under house arrest for 15 years, and he was guarded by French soldiers. He wasn't allowed to leave for those 15 years, and everything he did was watched by the French soldiers. Unfortunately, after 15 years, he passed away. But Phan Boi Chau is now known as one of the original people who started a revolution within Vietnam. And he's still a very famous figure for wanting to fight for Vietnamese independence.